MBS, which I can very strongly recommend to you if you're looking for an alternative to ABC FM. He's here tonight to talk to us about the Overland Telegraph Line. Would you please make welcome Professor Potts?
Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. I felt I detected a sort of a muffled anguish sigh when you mentioned that I'd been a professor of applied mathematics for so many years. I've already had someone come to me and say that they never could do maths, and that's a common reaction. Maths was my worst subject at school. And mathematics is different from history, and I thought I'd do a little bit of mathematics. I thought I'd do it now while you're fresh and get it over and done with. I know an audience like this is fascinated by dates, so I've included in my title page the years that I attended this school. Now I have a mathematical question which involves arithmetic, not simple arithmetic like addition, something much more complicated, subtraction. And I want you to use subtraction to work out with me how many years I spent at Prince's. Well, you subtract 1935 from 1942, and I hope we all get the same answer, 7. Right. And so I spent 7 years at Prince's, right? No, wrong. That's right. You've got to watch your arithmetic. Well, that's my one bit of maths. Nevertheless, I'm conscious of the difference between mathematical facts and historical facts. If I were giving a lecture on mathematics, I could be pretty sure that everything I said could not be challenged. Giving a lecture on history, I'm pretty sure that almost everything I say can be challenged. Historical facts are rubbery, leading to controversy between historians, and I will illustrate that in what I'm talking about tonight. In fact, the kink in the Overland Telegraph Line has a very kinky history. Unfortunately, it's very easy for an incorrect historical statement to be printed and thereby acquire the status of a historical fact, and especially when it gets copied. I'll give one example of this, and I mention this because it's a potential example of that happening, and I want to nip it in the bud straight away. When I was introduced, and this was also listed in the publicity for this talk, when I was introduced, it was mentioned that I had doctorate degrees from the University of Cambridge. Well, for the last few years I wouldn't mind being referred to as a graduate of the University of Cambridge, because Cambridge have beaten Oxford in the annual boat race 7 years on the trot. But this year Oxford won, and so I want to correct that statement that I'm a graduate of the University of Cambridge. I'm a graduate of the University of Oxford, and I'm proudly wearing my Oxford tie tonight. Okay. In the publicity material for this talk, I gave 4 clues to the identity of this gentleman. I said that in the vicinity of Alice Springs there were 4 geographical features named after him: a plain, a bluff, a dam and a creek. I will give a 5th clue. One of his great-grandsons, Malcolm Turner, is here tonight, and it gives me the opportunity to acknowledge that I'm using quite a lot of material that he has gathered. It might be interesting to have a show of hands of those who are descended from a worker on the line. Is there anyone else? Fine. Now to the kink. There have been 2 comprehensive histories published on the Overland Telegraph, one by Frank Clune and one by Peter Taylor, and I'm not going to cover what they've covered. That is the story of the line from Port Augusta to Darwin. I'm just going to concentrate on the kink. You may not be able to see, but that's the little blip in the McDonald Ranges. This is taken from Taylor's book, and this is taken from Clune's book. This is in more detail, and you can see the kink here. Incidentally, you'll notice that I'm using an innovative form of pointer. These laser red dots I find I can never see, and so I'm using a new type of pointer, this thing here. It has the tremendous advantage that it doubles up as a walking stick. I'm going to give this talk in 3 parts. First, I'll summarise how the kink occurred. Then I'll talk about some kinky history, about some of the personnel involved and some of the controversies which arose. And then I'll talk about how the gap in the McDonald's was finally found. So this is part 1, the kink summary. The grand plan of Charles Todd was to follow the route which had been pioneered by John McDouall Stuart, there, except for the last part to Darwin. And John McDouall Stuart said that his route could be easily followed except through the McDonald Ranges. The path taken by Stuart was not suitable for drays and moving stock and things like that through it. He said that would be no good. But the rest of it, he said, was certainly going to be useful. And so this meant that Todd had to concentrate his attention on the central section involving the passage through the McDonald Ranges, and he divided this central section into 5, A, B, C, D and E, and he had various people, and I'm going to concentrate on 2, McMinn and Mills, in this region here, and he specified, being an astronomer and a surveyor, he gave them directions which were very precise. He told them exactly what latitude they should start at and what latitude they should finish at. Now, I wonder whether you know what latitude means. Well, it means horizontally like this. This line here is latitude 26. This line, which is most important for us, is latitude 24. And he specified that they should follow Stuart's path for 1.5 degrees of latitude, from 25.5 to 24 and 24 to 22.5. He just specified the latitude. He didn't specify the longitude, which goes that way, because he said you just simply follow Stuart's path. So he just specified the latitude, and McMinn should go from here from 25.5 to 24, and Mills should go from 24 to 22.5. That's the way he designed it. This is from Clune's book, and you can see that a lot of effort went into this writing of this book. Frank Clune spent 18 years of research and the writing, and lists in his book 137 sources of information, and I haven't in any way tried to challenge what he has said. Unfortunately, he doesn't in the text give the references to the primary sources. He just lists at the end all of those he looked at. So sometimes you can't actually refer to where the source is used. But this is what he says about these 2 sections, Section B and Section C. Section B and Section C. Those are the important ones relating to the kink at the McDonald Ranges. Section B, in charge of surveyor Gilbert McMinn. And his plan was to follow the Fink and the Hugh rivers. This is the way that McDouall Stuart went, the Fink River and then the Hugh River, which is a branch of that, to the Waterhouse Range. The Waterhouse Range is a small range which is south and parallel to the McDonald Ranges, terminating there at latitude 24 degrees south to link with Section C. That's what Gilbert McMinn had to do. And Central Section C, he lists this, in charge of surveyor William Whitfield Mills, and assisted by surveyor Adam George Burt. This section had to cross the McDonald Ranges to latitude 22.5 degrees. Now, it's a further clue to the mystery man that the mystery man is one of those 3. The construction proceeded northward from here, and McMinn kept on polling the route, and although Todd arranged for an expedition, in fact 2 expeditions, to look for a pass through the MacDonald Ranges. It wasn't found. McMinn proceeded, and of course all he had to do was to get to 24 degrees latitude. He got there all right, but by the time he got there, the pass had not been found. And so that's why it wasn't until later when they found the pass was about 20 miles to the east, and so they had to go this way, and the kink arose. So roughly speaking, that's a summary about how the kink arose. They were given instructions to go from one latitude to another latitude and so on, but no instructions about the longitude except follow Stewart's path, and without them finding this gap until they got to this point, that meant there was a detour of about 20 to 30 miles. Well, the kink starts at latitude 24 degrees and at a place called Owen Springs, and that's where my kinky history really starts. So this is part 2, this is the kinky history. Right. Now, John McDouall Stuart led six expeditions from Adelaide northwards, got further each time, and on the 6th got to the coast at north. He got through the MacDonalds in expedition number 4. He didn't divert from the track he'd already taken in previous expeditions. He knew where there was water, and so he wanted to get as quickly as he could up north, and so he followed the same track each time. He got through the MacDonalds in the 4th expedition, and this is an account of what happened in the 5th expedition. His journals were edited by William Hardman, and he titles the book From Mr. Stewart's Manuscript, and this is what he describes in Hardman's book. On Saturday the 16th of March 1861, this is Stewart's 5th trip. Proceeded on to the second bend of the creek from the Waterhouse Range, that's the one which is south of the MacDonalds, close to the MacDonalds, to a water which I consider to be a spring. That's what he found in his previous expedition. And am glad to see there is still a large hole of beautiful water with bulrushes growing round it. This water I have named Owen Springs after William Owen, Esquire, MP. So an interesting historical fact. However, that was not a primary source of information. The handwritten diary of McDouall Stuart has been kept, and you can see his wording. It starts very much the same. It doesn't matter which transparency you look at for a start. It says, proceeded on to the second bend of the creek from Waterhouse Range to a water which and growing. This water I have named Ewart Springs after Ewart for his care and attention to our provisions and the things connected with them. Now, you cannot completely blame Hardman, because when McDouall Stuart submitted this to the Parliament, it was the parliamentarians. They're a funny bunch, aren't they, down on North Terrace? That they changed the name from to one of their MPs to William Owen. But I think it's scandalous that Hardman should write in this way and say that this water I have named Owen Springs. That's scandalous. And that's just an example of the kinky sort of history that I'll be talking about. Now, William Hardman was not very popular. Mathematicians usually don't scrap with each other, but historians seem to go for each other whenever they get the chance. And Mona Stewart Webster, a descendant of McDouall Stuart, has written a definitive biography of John McDouall Stuart, and this is what she reckons about Hardman. That Stuart's diaries of his 6 journeys were published in a collected edition edited by William Hardman, M.A. F.R.G.S., who so mutilated them that they are both incomplete and unreliable. So that's an indication of the sort of scrap that was going between different historians. I want to show next a reproduction of a painting of Owen Springs on the Hugh River. It's a magnificent spot. This is a painting by David Byard. It was painted last year, so bringing this history right up to date, and it was presented and shown here in Adelaide in the Kidman Centenary Art Exhibition. A beautiful representation of, and it's called Hugh River, Owen Springs. It's time, of course, to divulge who the mystery person is. It's Adam George Burt. I've just sketched here the region around the KINK, and I've put in just a few of the names of the people concerned. And you can see beyond Alice Springs, you can see, well, east of Alice Springs there's Burt Bluff, north is Burt Dam, Burt Plain and Burt Creek. And those names are in the atlas. The atlas I use for this region is a Reader's Digest atlas. I've got a copy of it here, 1977, which is an excellent source of information. And so the mystery man is Adam George Burt. And this shows as well other people that are involved. This is the Fink River, this is the Hugh River taking off, and you can see Owen Springs and Waterhouse Range there. And we're going to talk about some of the people involved in the other regions related to Alice Springs. You remember that Adam George Burt was the second in charge of the Section C. The leader of the section was William Whitfield Mills. This is a family tree, just to illustrate where Adam George Burt is. You can see up here. And his wife was Emily Fenn, and you'll see on this there's a fen gap, and this fen gap is one of the gaps through which the Overland Telegraph ran. There's also a son-in-law is Archibald Conway. You can see here a Mount Conway, and Mount Conway is very close to where the Stuarts' passage through the MacDonalds occurred. There's also Emily Fenn. There's also Emily Gap, but there were so many Emilys around, it's not sure whether that's that one or not. This gives us an indication of the respect with which Adam George Burt was held, and we have next some photographs. The first is of Burt Bluff. This was taken from a postcard that we bought in Alice Springs. Maybe the postcard was taken for the ghost guns, but that's Burt Bluff. It's a very prominent geological feature just east of Alice Springs. And the next one, Burt Plain. This one is taken from Taylor's book, a more recent photograph. That's Burt Plain, and that's north of Alice Springs once you've got through the MacDonald Ranges. What a contrast. And that road, which is heading north, of course, is called the Stuart Highway and follows the route that Stuart took. And so that's Burt Plain. So this is the photo of Adam George Burt, and you can see his position on the family tree. And he was written up in this book, The Notable South Australians. It was bad luck. When I prepared the material for the publicity, I had said he was a notable South Australian. I thought that might be an extra clue, but that was dropped. And this is what it says. Notable South Australians in this book. Arrived in South Australia by the ship Rajasthan, November 16, 1838. Was in the government service under the Deputy Surveyor General in laying out Gumaraka. It's incredible what these early colonists did without background in this sort of work. In 1845, travelled to Port Phillip, returning with a herd of cattle. In 1848, rode overland to Sydney, bringing down a mob of horses. In 1870, He was the second in command of the Central Construction Party. We've seen that. He was second to Mills in Section C. And in 1871 travelled with one white man and one native to meet the Northern Party. He reached the Catherine and brought the first message through from Patterson. Of affable and genial manners, there are few pioneer settlers that have done more real good for society at large. So that's what is written in the text, Notable South Australians. His son-in-law, Archibald Conway, this is quite a remarkable coincidence, in 1855, aged 13, arrived in Adelaide on the sailing ship Irene. Also on board was Charles Todd, who was in charge of construction of the whole line. And this is a quote from one of his letters home. He is, like all Irish boys, a capital climber. That's Charles's spelling, not mine. And never so happy as when aloft or borrowed with the men, and is in consequence a great favourite with them. I've seen him frequently go up to the royal masthead and stand on the royal yard. So that's Charles Todd writing about Archibald Conway. Next. And the coincidence continues. Conway became manager of the Peak outstation, that's near Lake Eyre. It was the main depot for the construction of the south and central sections of the Overland Telegraph Line. On the 10th of November 1870, he would have welcomed Charles Todd. That's when Charles came there. So that's a nice thought. It was also here that he met Adam George Burt, who 14 years later was to become his father-in-law. Coincidentally, in 1875, Conway became manager of Owen Springs Station. Now, I've mentioned about Owen Springs being the start of the KINK, and a station was formed there. This brings now to the other part of the family tree. This is the book written by Jill Bowen, Kidman, the Forgotten King, published in 1987. You can see here that there's a bit of tension between historians. Others have insisted for 50 years that Owen Springs was the first place that Sidney Kidman acquired. It was his second. Historians point with authority to 1886 as the date when Kidman obtained Owen Springs. It is impossible. It'd be wonderful to be working in a subject like this when you could say those things. I mean, if I said 2 + 2 = 5, that's the sort of response you'd get. But in history, you can really have a lot of fun. He bought it on the 20th of August 1896 and sold it in 1901. One of the Kidman family companies, Thomas Kidman, a partner, mentioned up here, Thomas Kidman, a partner, bought the station in 1930. And as a matter of fact, that's not a very accurate statement. And it was taken up in the book which accompanied the art exhibition by David and Marty Bide. I showed the painting of Hugh River Owen Springs by David Bide, in which they've extended that a little bit further and said Oakton Hill Limited, a subsidiary of S. Kidman and Co., repurchased Owen Springs in 1930. And I have a member of the Kidman family here tonight who says that's definitely false. So it's just... All right, so that ends the kinky history. Now I want to talk about in a bit more detail about the finding of the gap. Now, Todd knew right from the beginning that there was going to be trouble with the MacDonald Ranges. And so he formed an expedition immediately when he started the construction of the line, and it was led by John Ross, who was a marvellous bushman. And John Ross headed off, and in these 2 explorations was not successful. So he headed off and decided that he would go east from the track of the Hugh River, which ended in a no pass as far as the Overland Telegraph Line was concerned. He went to the east, and he came with tremendous difficulty. He's nearly always out of water, nearly always out of food. Incredible story. He came to the Todd River because it wasn't flowing. He crossed the Todd River, just over the banks and the dry water shed, the water bed. Had he followed the Todd River, he would have found that instead of going from west to east, it actually turned, and he would have gone Heavy Tree Gap and got to Alice Springs, and that would be the end of the story. And I wouldn't have to be giving a lecture tonight. Yet unfortunately for you, he headed north. He came to this creek, Giles Creek. Alfred Giles was one of the party. Crossed the Ferguson Range, headed north, and then returned the same way. He'd already found going this way that it was impassable as far as stock and drays were concerned, but he didn't try to find another route. He came back the same way to report back here at Aliceville that you couldn't get through that way. That was a bit of a disappointment. And so Todd arranged that he should go off again on another expedition. So he went on his second expedition, and he headed through the same way, which he knew was no good, and then went up north, and then came back, believe it or not, and this was under instructions from Todd, because Todd thought he would have found something. He came back by Stewart's Pass, which everybody knew was no good. And Todd had arranged that when he came back that there would be a discussion between the people involved in Section B and Section C, namely McMinn and Mills, about which way to go. Well, you can see what they thought of Ross at that time. This is one of the party, was not reticent about it, said that his previous explorations have not been of the least service to us. The delay, the whole of which may be fairly attributed to Mr. Ross, will tell heavily upon us, and especially for further sections. And that's the way in which this trouble started, of not finding a pass. Well, it was decided that McMinn and Mills would head off and see whether they could find something. By this time, McMinn had got to Owen Springs, and so they started at Owen Springs and headed off. And McMinn was successful. The first pass he found, show this, was called Temple Bar. This was to the east of Stewart's Pass. This is Temple Bar. He found this pass, and this is what Taylor in his book, yes, the End of Silence, writes. This is his book written in 1980. The name of Temple Bar in the MacDonald Ranges has been changed to Honeymoon Gap. And although those who started their married life in its vicinity are welcome to call it what they like, the rest of us would be grateful for less confusion, especially as many maps still show it as Temple Bar. You see what I mean by a kinky history. So McMinn found Temple Bar, or Honeymoon Gap, and then proceeded further, and then this magnificent find, which is now a great tourist attraction, Simpson's Gap. He was in a tremendous dust storm there and couldn't proceed any further, but he climbed up to the top and could see that once you got through Simpson's Gap, you were going to be headed in the open country, and he felt sure that you could get through. So McMinn found Temple Bar and the Simpson's Gap, and Mills was also looking, and when they got together, they decided that Mills would try again, because this was really Mills' territory. We were now beyond Owen Springs. We were in Section C. So the sketch region. So this is how Frank Clune, in his book, you remember 18 years to research and write, 137 listed references. On the 18th of March 1871, a party led by Mills and Burt as his assistant discovered the gorge later to be known as Heavy Tree Gap, about 30 miles east of the Hugh, and a pool of clear water which Mills named Alice Springs in honour of Mrs. Alice Todd. Now that's how Frank Clune reports it, but Malcolm Turner, who has looked into this, doubts very much whether that is in fact correct. Unfortunately, Frank Clune does not give the source of his reference for this. It's certainly agreed that Mills was there, but it may not have been Bird. In other places, it's just referred to as a white man and an Aboriginal. And so that's another controversial thing, that it may not have been Bird. The line went through, from Iron Springs through Fern Gap, went through Temple Bar, and then through Simpson's Gap, I haven't shown that there, and eventually to Alice Springs. Later on, the KINK was taken out. Instead of going up the Hugh River, it headed straight for Heavy Tree Gap and went north through there. And that's the way the present road and the present railway line go. So that was the KINK was soon removed. The controversy has not yet ended. Have the next one. This is Major General Signs, and this is quite an interesting, comes from an interesting document, and the university has a copy of this. The discovery and naming of Alice Springs, Major General Signs, 1957, quite some time after all of this has been happening. During recent years, the discovery and naming of Alice Spring, has been given prominence in the publication Centralian Advocate. That's a paper in Alice Springs. It has also been the subject of a short treatise read on the 21st of April 1955 to the Historical Society, the SA branch of the Royal Geological Society of Australasia. How's that? The writers of both the press contribution and the treatise give the credit to John Ross. It is desired here to refer to documentary evidence indicating that the discovery and naming of Alice Springs should be accredited to William Whitfield Mills. And the documentation is, as far as I'm concerned, very, very worthy of agreeing with this statement. You might have thought that that was the end of it. This was 1957, but the pot is still boiling. This is a comparative recent publication by the late Elliot Whitfield Mills, obviously a descendant of William, and he, in the book, quotes from what Mills has written. Again arrived in the MacDonald Range and was successful in finding a pass about 30 miles east of Stewart's Track with numerous waterholes and spring, the principal of which is the Alice Spring, which I had the honour of naming after Mrs. Todd. Mills named the pass Heavy Tree Gap after his school in Devon. He also goes on, has a special chapter, chapter 4, leave it then, chapter 4, the rival claim to discovery of Alice Springs. See, this is going on, this is 1957, you thought the Major General had finished things off here, not on your life. I'm not making any comment about who's right and who's wrong, but regrettably in the 1970s, a descendant of John Ross attempted to establish that Ross was in fact the discoverer of Alice Springs. And so Elliot Whitfield Mills has a lot of other documentation supporting what Major General Symes has said. There's one interesting thing about this, and it's mentioned in other places, that Heavy Tree Gap was named after Mills's school in Devon. Being new to history, it's only just recently become interesting to me that some explorers are known by two names, like Charles Todd and Charles Sturt, others with three names, Adam George Burt, John McDowell Stewart. And I often wondered whether Charles Todd had a middle name. And I thought, well, perhaps I ought to, before this lecture, have a bit of a search for it. In most of the encyclopedias and things, he's just listed as Charles Todd. And then I was lent a copy of The Singing Line by Alice Thompson, and on the front cover there is listed Charles Todd's second name. And guess what it is? Heavitree. Now, I wanted to follow this up and see whether there's, having named Alice Springs after Alice, whether in fact there was any connection between Charles' second name and this naming of the Heavitree. It was really quite sad when I tried to contact Elliot Whitfield Miles. He had just passed away. I would have loved to have discussed it with him. Right. That's nearly the end of my story. Sketch of the KINK region. This is from the book Central Australia by Cecil Madigan, one of the great South Australian geologists and explorers, a magnificent person. And he devotes a chapter to his explorations by camel through the Western McDonald Ranges. It's a marvellous story and well told. He went with a young geology student, Eric Rudd, who died just last year. And neither of them had ever ridden camels before, and Cecil Madigan gives a tremendous description of their first attempts at trying to ride them. But Eric Rudd, unfortunately in his last couple of years, lost practically all sight in his eyes, and I used to go and read to him, and I read the account of this particular exploration to him, and it was amazing. It would have done some of you historians a lot of good. I would read out something and Eric Rudd would say, no, no, wrong, wrong. Cecil Madigan had made it quite clear that Eric Rudd was not to keep notes and was not to write about the history. That was not his business. Cecil Madigan was in charge of it, and he would be the one that would write it. And it was quite astonishing. There's a lot of the, well, not a lot, but several details in that chapter. Eric Rudd would burst out and tell me what really happened. One of them, if you know about the Mount Saunders, which is to the west of where we're talking about, and Cecil Madigan claimed to be the first white man to climb it, there were lots of no, no, no's when I read that part out. But I read this part out, and it was very moving. And you can see how Cecil Madigan thought about it. Along the Hugh we were on historic ground. There was a thrill about the next 6 miles as we passed the self-same way as Stewart. Madigan, who had read a lot about the history of this part before he started this expedition, did not know about the kink in the Overland Telegraph. So I just want to finish with a summary about how did the kink arise. This was the route that McDowell Stewart followed. When you got to 24 degrees south, that was where McMinn finished Section B. Section C, led by Mills with the assistant Adam George Burt, had to look for a passage through the McDonalds, and they had to move east this considerable distance, about 20 miles, and that's how the kink arose. I've just got 2 little things to finish with, and that's just to remind that everybody was right on their toes about the arithmetic here. You do that subtraction, and you have to add 1 at the end to make sure you get it right. You know, it's the sort of thing that cricket commentators get mixed up with in these one-day matches when there are 50 overs to be bowled, and they start saying at the beginning of the 47th over, they say 47, and I hear them say, oh, we've got 3 overs to go. And someone has said, I think we've got 4 overs to go. And there's usually a bit of discussion about whether it's really 3 or 4. You have to do the subtraction and then add on 1, because just as in cricket where you start the 47th over but you've got to finish the 50th, I started at the beginning of 1935 and end at the end of 1942. The simplest way to count on your fingers, as most of you did. Yes, I'll do that. I just mentioned two more things. At the very beginning, I said that in mathematics, it's quite common for people to almost boast about their inability to do mathematics. They wouldn't do that with other subjects, but mathematics, they come to me and boast about not being able to do it. And I think that's partly to do with the poor teaching and the poor content of what was taught in mathematics in our day. It has much improved. Mathematics is much more relevant now, and the teaching methods have greatly improved. I wondered what happened as far as history was concerned. And I did history up until fourth form at this school, and we were brought up on Britain and her neighbours. And I found, I've got it here, it's a handsome book. The strange thing about it is it's smaller than what I thought. I think, I think that kids think the books are very big, but it's beautifully bound. And it's Britain and her neighbours, book 5. Of course it gives the date, you had to learn all these things, 1485 to 1688, and in big capital letters, the New Liberty. I remember the book quite well. But, what a thing to present to a 13-year-old kid in Adelaide. Look at the blurb that started off. The aim of this series is to provide, in addition to the facts of British history, something extra, some broad outlines of the European history of which ours form a part. Fancy presenting that to a kid in Adelaide. It really is quite ridiculous. Irrelevant. Just as the history that I've talked about tonight really talked about people, so this history talked about people. And I've just listed, not at random, that every 20 odd years, I've listed some of the people that were mentioned, and some of them were quite famous people. And I remember having to learn those dates and learning about them. And you'll, of course, all recognise those dates. What do they refer to? The year in which their head was chopped off. The whole lot were executed. And the interest in the book was to read the gory details of the execution. I remember this with Sir Thomas More when he went into the Tower of London. You remember that he decided to grow a beard. And when he eventually was beheaded, he put his head on the block and he found that his beard was going to be cut. And he said to the executioner, "Wait." And he moved his beard so that his beard wouldn't be cut. I remember that indeed. And there were good details about all this. I mean, you can see that these executions were pretty regular throughout. And so that's an illustration of what I was taught, history. I didn't think it was very relevant, and I was jolly glad that at the age of 13 I was able to drop the subject. And lastly, I'd like to thank my wife, Barbara, for doing all the hard work, shuffling the transparencies, and of course not only has she been my right-hand helper, but she has been the inspiration for this talk, because that's where she figures on the family tree. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, any questions for Professor Potts?
Stuart went through a pass which is called Stuart's Pass. There's been some discussion about exactly where it is. I think the best reference to that is in Mona Webster's book.
where she has made use of various maps to try to determine exactly where it is. But I've seen other books which have come to other conclusions. It was really, roughly speaking, very close to Mount Conway. And the Overland Telegraph Party had to move a lot of equipment, wire and all that sort of thing, and they moved stock and everything like that. And so they had to have a pass where they could clear quite a wide passage through. And where MacDougall Stewart had just travelled with horses, and he could get through that without any trouble. But it was, no, it's not there. It was, as I say, it was about where the Hugh River came through the McDonald's, but not exactly. There's another tributary, the Jade, which they think is what he used. But it is contentious, and there's a recent book which has been published by a photographer who's done a lot of work in the Western McDonald's, in the Mount Conway region, and he doesn't agree with Mona Webster's conclusions. But it's pretty rough country. But you can imagine, of course, now how easy it is with Heathertree Gap. Of course, that was amazing. What a change.
I'd like to thank you on behalf of George Main, who you may or may not know. I'd be interested to know if you did know the name George Main. He participated in the transmission of the Morse code message from here to England that brought England in touch with Australia, or Australia in touch with England, and what was happening over there in the last war. And he's up there participating in the centenary celebrations, the same as our Prime Ministers are in England. But I don't know whether you'd know the name George Main as a Morse code transmitter.
No, I don't. The book by Peter Taylor, which I personally prefer to the one by Frank Clune, is more technical and talks a lot about the technical details of the Overland Telegraph Line. I did know people that have worked on these Overland Telegraph Lines, and I remember having the father of one of my schoolmates worked on Cocos Islands, and he used to show us how he could send a message just with the palm of his hand, and it was incredible to watch him. And he said that he could tell quite easily who was transmitting when he was receiving it, that it was just like someone's listening to their voice, recognising it. So there was a whole group of these people who were absolutely marvellous. Charles taught himself to send Morse, and you probably remember the exciting story of when the line was actually completed. He was at Central Mount Stewart, sitting in the cold with his little pocket key out, sending messages and receiving them. But no, I didn't know that particular story. Thank you for letting us know.
Persons present may be interested in that I was a lineman at Alice Springs in 1943-44, and about the 7th of January 1944, I actually changed the insulator on the pole that was become the bend when the line was straightened out. That's the type of insulator I replaced. That one actually was manufactured in 1938. There probably wasn't many manufactured of that type after that, because about 1939 or 1940, the Postmaster General's Department adopted this other type with only a single skirt. The old type had a double skirt. Some of the earlier insulators used were somewhat this shape, but because the Aborigines were taking the insulators and breaking them and using them as spear points. Some of the sections were, the insulators were covered with a galvanised cast iron cover to protect them from being broken by having stones thrown at them. On the matter of the name of Heavy Tree Gap, I suggest that perhaps there was another source of that, the most obvious one. What I knew and since I was there, back on the second couple of times more recently, perhaps Heavy Tree Gap itself may have been named by the fact that the trees along the Todd River were probably larger than the ones that came through the gaps east and west. Thanks.
Heavy Tree is actually a parish in Exeter, the administrative centre of Devon, and there's obviously a school there called Heavy Tree School, and that's, according to the story, is the source of Mill's name. I think it's very interesting to have an insulator brought in here. They're quite collector's items, and if you read the singing line, Alice and Ed are always looking for insulators all over Australia. Maybe someone's been manufacturing them and planting them.
Professor, a few weeks ago I was travelling from Edinburgh to Dundee, and the map, as I recall, showed a site which was the location of a museum of John McDowell Stuart, I think. Do you know of that museum, and would you know what's in it, or does anybody else know?
I think there are people here who are experts on John McDowell Stuart. There's a society, and there are people who know much more about it than I do, and I really would ask if there's anyone in the audience. And so, there is a John, yes?
The museum is in Dysart, which is a small port on the north coast of the Firth of Forth, and that's where Stuart was born on the 7th of September in 1815. There is a museum is actually in the home where Stuart was born, and it is open during the summer months.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a good historical answer.
One of the things I like about this society is the wealth of knowledge.
There was once a very good museum of telecommunications in King William Street, just north of the post office. Do you know what's happened to all that marvellous equipment?
Yes, it's gone to Whyalla. I think, Malcolm, you can confirm this.
Some of it went to...
And some went to...
It's spread all over the place, I think.
But
it was closed some years ago, and the building was sold, as I understand it, and part of the collection went to Whyalla, and I think... I'm not sure whether there was another telecommunications museum, Canberra, or... But I think the material was split up a bit, which is very unfortunate, because it was a magnificent collection.
Did anything go to the West Island Museum?
I
doubt it.
I doubt it, no. I think some of it might have gone to Alice Springs, to the museum there.
I probably should point out that, in fact, the History Trust took responsibility for much of the collection. When I started my current job 3 years ago, a lot of it was in the basement at Edmund Wright House. Some of it has recently gone out to Whyalla. Some of it is still in the basement, and it has actually been largely destroyed as a collection, which I think is a disaster.
Professor, Unmember Norman Mackenzie, let me assure you that some of the stuff, and I use the word stuff, is in Black Mountain Tower, The big difference, of course, in Black Mountain Tower as compared with King William Street is that the beautiful exchanges which worked in King William Street don't work at all. Thank you. I was in the Darwin area for a couple of years during the war and had to visit a radar station at Nucky's Lagoon. Nucky was either an engineer or a linesman, I don't know which, but the lagoon was a perfect ellipse. And during the war, artists were man-powered into doing camouflage work. And this artist, Jolliffe, had the famous cartoonist, he had disguised the radar station. He'd put a white railing fence around the lagoon so it looked exactly like a race course, and the radar and the other operations buildings were designed to look like a grandstand and a totalisator.
Well, if there are no more questions, I suspect a lot of you want to have a nice chat with the Professor over supper, and I'm sure he'll be happy to do that. Please make sure he gets some supper, however. But at this stage, I'll ask our Vice President, Maurice Kane, if he'll say a few words of thanks.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how I should tackle a Professor of Mathematics. I noticed he did make mention of 2 and 2 and discuss the possibility of 5, but I think I'll leave the mathematics to him, but I would just add that perhaps I would have enjoyed it a lot more had I had the Professor as my teacher in mathematics than those that I did have. I'm sure that all of us probably feel the same way. Tonight's talk was fascinating, as they usually are, and I'm certainly feel very humble in moving this vote of thanks to Professor Potts for this very enthralling talk that we've had. The illustrations were very clear and precise, and gave us a very clear view of what was under discussion.